Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to Nancy Drew Mystery Hour. And you know what? Super Bowl's on tonight. I didn't want to miss a chapter, but Super Bowl is on tonight. So if you would rather see the Super Bowl, please, by all means, go do that. And you can catch me later. This will be a recording, so you won't miss it. You just won't get to comment live. But a lot of people don't do that anyway, not when I'm reading, so that works. All right, so welcome. I am Sharon Schultz, also known as the Bay Lady. And generally, I do virtual tours around the Baltimore area, around the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of beautiful, really cool places, a lot of fun activities here to see. I also do podcast type things like this. And also, I do a Beatles trivia at lunchtime during the week. The thing is that I kind of cut back a little bit on doing the virtual tours. The only thing I have going on right now is this and trivia because of the weather, because of a broken arm. Can't afford to get out there and fall. So, but I'll be back doing other things after a while, shortly. Meanwhile, if you want to stay up, keep up with me and when my tours and what have you, be sure to follow me on Facebook, The Bay Lady, and also on YouTube, my channel, Sharon Schultz, The Bay Lady. If you follow me and subscribe, then you will get notices of when my tours are. Also, my tours are all tip based. So there is a link on YouTube and on Facebook, my pages for a platform called Buy Me a Coffee. And it's just a place where, you know, you could contribute to the cause, further content, what have you. All tips are, of course, very much appreciated. So now, with all that housekeeping out of the way, tonight we are reading, starting with chapter 10 of The Hidden Staircase by Carolyn Keene. This is the second book in the series of Nancy Drew Mysteries, which I think, well, I know number probably at least into the 50s. I don't know how much further than that. But at any rate, and without much further ado, let me wet the whistle here. Nothing, nothing like a nice hot cup of tea. That's the Irish in me. Okay. Chapter 10, The Midnight Watch. As soon as the two girls awoke the next morning, Nancy told Helen her plan. I'm with you, said Helen. Oh, I do wish we could solve the mystery of the ghost. I'm afraid that it's beginning to affect Miss Flora's health, and she won't leave Twin Elms. Well, maybe we can get Aunt Rosemary to keep her in the garden most of the day, Nancy suggested. It's perfectly beautiful outside. We might even serve lunch under the trees. I'm sure they'd love that, said Helen. As soon as we can get downstairs, let's propose it. Both women liked the suggestion. Aunt Rosemary had guessed their strategy and was appreciative of it. I'll wash and dry the dishes, Nancy offered when breakfast was over. Miss Flora, why don't you and Aunt Rosemary go outside right now and take advantage of this lovely sunshine? The frail, elderly woman smiled. There were deep circles under her eyes, indicating that she had a sleepless night. And I'll run the vacuum cleaner around and dust this first floor in less than half an hour, Helen said merrily. Her relatives caught sight. Sorry, her relatives caught the spirit of her enthusiasm, and Miss Flora remarked, I wish you girls lived here all the time. Despite our troubles, you have brought a feeling of gaiety back into our lives. Both girls smiled at the compliment. As soon as the two women had gone outdoors, the girls set to work with a will. At the end of the allotted half hour, the first floor of the mansion was spotless. Nancy and Helen next went to the second floor, quickly made the beds, and tidied the bathrooms. And now for that ghost, said Helen, brandishing her flashlight. Nancy took her own from a bureau drawer. Let's see if we can figure out how to climb these attic stairs without making them creak, Nancy suggested. Knowing how may come in handy sometime. This presented a real challenge. Every inch of each step was tried before the girls finally worked out a pattern to follow in ascending the stairway noiselessly. Helen laughed. This will certainly be a memory test, Nancy. I'll rehearse our directions. First step, put your foot to the left near the wall. Second step, right center. Third step, against the right wall. I'll need 3 feet to do that. Nancy laughed too. For myself, I think I'll skip the second step. Let's see. On the fourth and fifth, it's all right to step in the center, but on the sixth, you hug the left wall. On the seventh, the right wall. Helen interrupted. But if you step on the eighth any place, it will creak, so you skip it. 9, 10, and 11 are okay, Nancy recalled, but from there to 15 at the top, we're in trouble. Let's see if I remember, said Helen. On 12, you go left, then right again. How can you do that without a jump and losing your balance and tumbling down? How about skipping 14 and then stretching as far as you can to reach the top one at the left where it doesn't squeak? Nancy replied. Let's go. She and Helen went back to the second floor and began what was meant to be a silent ascent. Both of them made so many mistakes at first, the creaking was terrible. Finally, however, the girls had the silent spots memorized perfectly and went up noiselessly. Nancy clicked on her flashlight and swung it onto the nearest wood-paneled wall. Helen stared at it, then remarked, This isn't made of long panels from ceiling to floor. It's built of small pieces. That's right, said Nancy. But see if you don't agree with me that the spot back of the costume trunk near the chimney looks a little different. The grain doesn't match the other wood. The girls crossed the attic, and Nancy beamed her flashlight over the suspected paneling. It does look different, Helen said. This could be a door, I suppose, but there's no knob or other hardware on it. She ran her finger over a section just above the door, following the cracks at the edge of a 4 by 4.5 foot space. If it's a secret door, Nancy said, the knob's on the other side. How are we going to open it? Helen questioned. We might try prying the door open, Nancy proposed, but first I want to test it. She tapped the entire panel with her knuckles. A look of disappointment came over her face. There's certainly no hollow space behind it, she said. Let's make sure, said Helen. Suppose I go downstairs and get a screwdriver and a hammer. We'll see what happens when we drive the screwdriver through this crack. Good idea, Helen. While she was gone, Nancy inspected the rest of the attic walls and floor. She did not find another spot that seemed suspicious. By this time, Helen had returned with the tools. Inserting the screwdriver into one of the cracks, she began to pound on the handle of it with the hammer. Hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. Nancy watched hopefully. The screwdriver went through the crack very easily, but immediately met an obstruction on the other side. Helen pulled the screwdriver out. Nancy, you try your luck. The young sleuth picked a different spot, but the results were the same. There was no open space behind the wall. My hunch wasn't so good, said Nancy. Helen suggested that they give up and go downstairs. Anyway, I think the postman would be here soon. I'm expecting a letter from Jim. Mother said she would forward all of my mail. Oops, wrong way. I'm trying to get that glare gone. Oops, let's see. Okay. Nancy did not want to give up the search yet, but she nodded in agreement and waved her friend towards the stairs. Then the young detective sat down on the floor and cupped her chin in her hands. As she stared ahead, Nancy noticed that Helen, in her eagerness to meet the postman, had not bothered to go quietly down the attic steps. It sounded as if Helen had picked the squeakiest spot on each step. Nancy heard Helen go out the front door and suddenly realized that she was in the big mansion all alone. This may bring the ghost on a visit, she thought. If he's around, he may think I went outside with Helen, and I may learn where the secret opening is. Nancy sat perfectly still, listening intently. Suddenly, she flung her head up. Was it her imagination, or did she hear the creak of steps? She was not mistaken. She strained her ears, trying to determine where the sounds were coming from. I'm sure they're not from the attic stairs or the main staircase, and not the back stairway. Even if the ghost was in the kitchen and unlocked the door to the second floor, he knew that the one at the top of the stairs was locked from the other side. Nancy's heart suddenly gave a leap. She was positive that the creaking sounds were coming from somewhere behind the attic wall. A secret staircase, she thought excitedly. Maybe the ghost is entering the second floor. Nancy waited until the sound stopped. Then she got to her feet, tiptoed noiselessly down the attic stairs, and looked around. She could hear nothing. Was the ghost standing quietly in one of the bedrooms? Probably Miss Flora's. Treading so lightly that she did not make a sound, Nancy peered into each room as she reached it, but no one was in any of them. Maybe he's on the first floor, Nancy thought. She descended the main stairway, hugging the wall so she would not make a sound. Reaching the first floor, Nancy peered into the parlor. No one was there. She looked in the library, the dining room, and the kitchen. She saw no one. No one at all. So good. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Well, the ghost didn't come into the house after all, Nancy concluded. He may have intended to, but changed his mind. She felt more certain than at any time, however, that there was a secret entrance to Twin Elms Mansion from a hidden stairway. But how to find it? Suddenly, the young sleuth snapped her fingers. I know what to do. I'll set a trap for the ghost. She reflected that he had taken jewelry, but those thefts had stopped. Apparently, he was afraid to go to the second floor. I wonder if anything is missing from the first floor, she mused. Maybe he's taken silverware or helped himself to some food. The ghost. Going back to the door, Nancy opened it and called to Helen, who was now seated in the garden with Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary. What say we start lunch? She called, not wishing to distress Miss Flora by bringing up the subject of their latest mystery. Okay, said Helen. In a few moments, she joined Nancy, who asked if her friend had received a letter. Helen's eyes sparkled. I sure did. Oh, Nancy, I can hardly wait for Jim to get home. Nancy smiled. The way you describe him, I can hardly wait to see him myself. Then she told Helen the real reason she had called her into the kitchen. She described the footsteps on what she was sure was a hidden, creaking stairway. Then she added, if we discover that food or something else is missing, we'll know he's been here again. Helen offered to inspect the flat silver. I know approximately how many pieces should be in the buffet drawer, she said. And I'll look over the food supplies, Nancy suggested. I have a pretty good idea what was in the refrigerator and on the pantry shelf. It was not many minutes before each of the girls discovered articles missing. Nancy said that Nancy said that several cans of food, some eggs, and a quart of milk had been taken. Helen said that nearly a dozen teaspoons were gone. On a sudden hunch, Nancy took down from the wall a memo pad and pencil which hung there. Putting a finger to her lips to indicate that Helen was not to comment, Nancy wrote on the sheet, I think the only way to catch the ghost is to trap him. I believe he has one or more microphones hidden someplace and that he hears all our plans. Nancy looked up at Helen, who nodded silently. Nancy continued to write, I don't want to worry Miss Flora or Aunt Rosemary, so let's keep our plans a secret. I suggest we go to bed tonight as usual and carry on a conversation about our plans for tomorrow. But actually, we won't take off our clothes. Then about midnight, let's tiptoe downstairs to watch. I'll wait in the kitchen. Do you want to stay in the living room? Again, Helen nodded. Nancy, thinking that they had been quiet too long, and that if there was an eavesdropper nearby, he might become suspicious. Said aloud, "What would Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary like for lunch, Helen?" Why, Helen found it hard to transfer to the new subject. "They both love soup." "Then I'll make cream of chicken soup," said Nancy. "Hand me a can of chicken and rice, and I'll get the milk." As Helen was doing this, Nancy lighted a match and held her recently written note over the sink and set fire to the paper. Nancy smiled. "Helen thinks of everything," she thought to herself. The girls chatted gaily as they prepared the food and finally carried 4 trays out to the garden. They didn't mention their midnight plan. The day in the garden was proving to be most beneficial for Miss Flora, and the girls were sure she would sleep well that night. Nancy's plan was followed to the letter. Just as the grandfather clock in the hall was striking midnight, Nancy arrived in the kitchen and sat down to await developments. Helen was posted in a living room chair near both rooms, but the girls in both rooms near the hall doorway. Moonlight streamed into both rooms, but the girls had taken seats in the shadows. Helen was mentally rehearsing the further instructions which Nancy had written to her during the afternoon. The young sleuth had suggested that if Helen should see anyone, she was to run to the front door, open it, and yell, "Police!" At the same time, she was trying to watch where the intruder disappeared to. The minutes clicked by. There wasn't a sound in the house. Then suddenly, Nancy heard the front door open with a bang, and Helen's voice yelled loudly and clearly, "Police! Help! Police!" The plot begins, does it not? Yes, indeed. Chapter 11. By the time Nancy reached the front hall, Tom Patrick, the police guard, had rushed into the house. "Here I am," he called. "What's the matter?" Nancy led the way into the living room and switched on the chandelier light. "That sofa next to the fireplace," she said in a trembling voice. "It moved. I saw it move." "You mean somebody moved it?" the detective asked. I don't know," Helen replied. "I couldn't see anybody." Nancy walked over to the old-fashioned sofa, set in the niche alongside the fireplace. Certainly the piece was in its place now. If the ghost had moved it, he'd returned the sofa to its original position. "Let's pull it out and see what we can find," Nancy suggested. She tugged at one end while the guard pulled the other. It occurred to Nancy that a person who moved it alone would have to be pretty strong. "Do you think your ghost came up through a trap door or something?" the detective asked. Neither of the girls replied. They had previously searched the area, and even now, as they looked over every inch of the floor and the 3 walls that surrounded the high sides of the couch, they could detect nothing that looked like an opening. By this time, Helen looked a bit sheepish. "I guess I was wrong," she said. Turning to the police guard, she said, "I'm sorry to have taken you away from your work. Don't feel too badly about it, but I'd better get back to my guard duty," said the man, and he left the house. "Oh, Nancy," Helen cried out. "I'm so sorry." She was about to say more, but Nancy put a finger to her lips. "They could use the same strategy for trapping the thief at another time. In case the thief might be listening, Nancy did not want to give away their secret. Nancy felt that after all the uproar, the ghost would not appear again that night. She motioned to Helen that they would go quietly upstairs and get some sleep. Hugging the walls of the driveway once more, they ascended noiselessly, tiptoed to their room, and got into bed. I'm certainly glad we didn't wake up Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary, said Helen sleepily as she whispered good night. Though Nancy had been sure the ghost would not enter the mansion again that night, she discovered in the morning that she'd been mistaken. More food had been stolen sometime between midnight and 8 o'clock when she and Helen had started breakfast. Had the ghost taken it for personal use or only to worry the occupants of 12 Elms? I missed my chance this time, Nancy murmured to her friend. After this, I'd better not trust what the ghost's next move may be. At 9 o'clock, Hannah Gruen telephoned the house. Nancy happened to answer the ring, and after the usual greetings, was amazed to hear Hannah say, "I'd like to speak to your father." "Why, Dad isn't here," Nancy told her. "Don't you remember? The telegram said he wasn't coming." "He's not there?" Hannah exclaimed. "Oh, this is bad, Nancy. This is very bad." "What do you mean, Hannah?" Nancy asked fearfully. The housekeeper explained that soon after receiving the telegram on Tuesday evening, Mr. Drew himself had phoned. He wanted to know if you were still in Cliffwood, Nancy. When I told him yes, he said he would stop off there on his way home Wednesday. Nancy was frightened, but she asked steadily, "Hannah, did you happen to mention the telegram to him?" "No, I didn't," the housekeeper replied. "I didn't think it was necessary." "Hannah, darling," Nancy said, almost on the verge of tears, "I'm afraid that telegram was a hoax." "A hoax?" Mrs. Gruen cried out. "Yes, Dad's enemies sent it to keep me from meeting him." "Oh, Nancy," Hannah wailed. "You don't suppose those enemies that Mr. Gomber warned you about could have waylaid your father and are holding him prisoner?" "I'm afraid so," said Nancy. Her knees began to quake and she sank into the chair alongside the telephone table. "What'll we do?" Hannah asked. "Do you want me to notify the police?" "Not yet. Let me do a little checking first." "All right, Nancy, but let me know what happens." "I will." Nancy put the phone down, then looked at the various telephone directories which lay on the table. Finding one which contained River Heights members, she looked for the number of the telegraph office and put in a call. She asked the clerk who answered to verify that there had been a telegram for Mr. Drew on Tuesday. After a few minutes, the reply came. "We have no record of such a telegram." Okay. No record, huh? Halftime at the Super Bowl. I had the Super Bowl on, but not the volume. And what's his face? That dude is doing the Super Bowl show. It's the guy that won all the Grammys the other night. Forget his name. Okay, so Nancy thanked the clerk and hung up. By this time, her hands were shaking with fright. What on earth had happened to her father? Getting control of herself, Nancy telephoned the airport, the railroad station, and the bus lines. She inquired about any accidents which might have occurred on the trips from Chicago the previous day or on Tuesday night. In each case, she was told there had been none. Oh, what shall I do? Nancy thought in dismay. Immediately, an idea came to her, and she put in a call to the Chicago hotel where her father had registered. Although she thought it unlikely, it was just possible that he had changed his mind again and was still there. But a conversation with the desk clerk dashed that hope. No, Mr. Drew is not here. He checked out Tuesday evening. I don't know his plans, but I'll connect you with the head porter. He may be able to help you. In a few seconds, Nancy was asking the porter what he could tell her to help her clear up the mystery of her father's disappearance. All I know, miss, is that your father told me he was taking a sleeper train and getting off somewhere Wednesday morning to meet his daughter. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much, said Nancy. You've helped me a great deal. So her father had taken the train home and probably had reached the Clifton station. Now she must find out what happened to him after that. Nancy told Aunt Rosemary and Helen what she had learned, then got in her convertible and drove directly to the Clifton station. There she spoke to the ticket agent. Unfortunately, he could not identify Mr. Drew from Nancy's description as having been among the passengers who got off either of the two trains arriving from Chicago on Wednesday. Nancy went to speak to the taximan. Judging by the line of cabs, she decided that all the drivers who served the station were on hand at the moment. There had been no outgoing trains for nearly an hour, and an incoming express was due in about 15 minutes. I'm in luck, the young detective told herself. Surely one of these men must have driven Dad. She went from one to another, but each of them denied having carried a passenger of Mr. Drew's description the day before. By this time, Nancy was in a panic. She hurried inside the station to a telephone booth and called the local police station. Nancy asked to speak to the captain, and in a moment he came on the line. Captain Rosalind speaking, he said crisply. Nancy poured out her story. She told of the warning her father had received in River Heights and her fear that some enemy of his was now detaining the lawyer against his will. This is very serious, Miss Drew, Captain Rosalind stated. I will put men on the case at once, he said. As Nancy left the phone booth, a large gray-haired woman walked up to her. Pardon me, miss, but I couldn't help overhearing what you said. I believe maybe I can help you. Nancy was surprised and slightly suspicious. Maybe this woman was connected with the abductors and had planned to make Nancy a prisoner too by promising to take her to her father. Don't look so frightened, the woman said, smiling. All I wanted to do is tell you that I'm down here at the station every day to take a train to the next town. I'm a nurse and I'm on a case over there right now. I see, Nancy said. Well, yesterday I was here when the Chicago train came in. I noticed a tall, handsome man, such as you describe your father to be, step off the train. He got into the taxi driven by a man named Harry. I have a feeling that for some reason the cabbie isn't telling the truth. Let's talk to him. Nancy followed the woman, her heart beating furiously. She was ready to grab at any straw to get a clue to her father's whereabouts. "Hello, Miss Gade," the taxi man said. "How are you today?" "Oh, I'm all right," the nurse responded. "Listen, Harry, you told this young lady that you didn't carry any passengers yesterday that looked like her father. Now, I saw one get into your cab. What about it?" Harry hung his head. "Listen, miss," he said to Nancy, "I got 3 kids, and I don't want nothing to happen to them. See?" "What do you mean?" Nancy asked, puzzled. When the man did not reply, Miss Gade said, "Now look, Harry, this girl's afraid that her father has been kidnapped. It's up to you to tell her all you know." "Kidnapped?" the taxi man shouted. "Oh, good night. Now I don't know what to do." Nancy had a sudden thought. "Has somebody been threatening you, Harry?" she asked. The cab driver's eyes nearly popped from his head. "Well, since you've guessed it, I'd better tell you everything I know." He went on to say that he'd taken a passenger who fit Mr. Drew's description toward Twin Elms, where he said he wanted to go. Just as we were leaving the station, 2 other men came up and jumped into my cab. They said they were going a little further than that and would I take them. Well, about halfway to Twin Elms, one of those men ordered me to pull to the side of the road and stop. He told me the stranger had blacked out. He and his buddy jumped out of the car and laid the man on the grass. "How ill was he?" Nancy asked. "I don't know. He was unconscious. Just then another car came along behind us and stopped. The driver got out and offered to take your father to a hospital. The 2 men said okay." Nancy took heart. Maybe her father was in a hospital and had not been abducted at all. But a moment later, her hopes were again dashed when Harry said, "I told those guys I'd be glad to drive the sick man to a hospital, but one of them turned on me, shook his fist, and yelled, 'You just forget everything that's happened, or it'll be too bad for you and your kids.'" "Oh," Nancy cried out. And for a second, everything seemed to swim before her eyes. She clutched the door handle of the taxi for support. There was no question now but that her father had been drugged and kidnapped. Hmm. Okay. Coming up on the last chapter for this evening. Chapter 12 it will be. Dude's still performing the halftime show. He's got a whole crew out there on the field. Major production going on here. Okay. Oh yeah, he's got lots of people on stage dancing. They're all dressed in red, white, and blue. How patriotic, right? Chapter 12. The newspaper clue. Mrs. Miss Gate, Miss Gade grabbed Nancy. "Do you feel ill?" the nurse asked quickly. "Oh, I'll be all right," Nancy replied. "This news has been a great shock to me." "Is there any way I can help you?" the woman questioned. "I'd be very happy to." "Thank you, but I guess not," the young sleuth said. Smiling ruefully, she added, "But I must get busy and do something about this." The nurse suggested that perhaps Mr. Drew is in one of the local hospitals. She gave Nancy the names of 3 hospitals in town. The nurse suggested Let's see through. I'll get in touch with them at once, the young detective said. You've been miskind. Here comes your train, Miss Gade. Goodbye, and again, thanks a million for your help. Harry climbed out of his taxi and went to stand at the platform to signal passengers for his cab. Nancy hurried after him, and before the train came in, asked if he would please give her a description of the two men who had been with her father. Well, both of them were dark and kind of athletic looking, not what I'd call handsome. One of them had an upper tooth missing, and the other fella, his left ear was kind of crinkled, if you know what I mean. I understand, said Nancy. I'll give a description of the two men to the police. She went back to the telephone booth and called each of the three hospitals, asking if anyone by the name of Carson Drew had been admitted, or possibly a patient who was not conscious and had no identification. Only Mercy Hospital had a patient who had been unconscious since the day before, but he definitely was not Mr. Drew. He was Chinese. Sure now that her father was being held in some secret hiding place, Nancy went at once to police headquarters and relayed the taxi man's story. Captain Rosalind looked extremely concerned. This is alarming, Miss Drew, he said, but I feel sure we can trace that fellow with the crinkly ear and we'll make him tell us where your father is. I doubt, though, that there's anything you can do. You'd better just leave it to the police. Nancy said nothing. She was reluctant to give up even trying to do something, but she acquiesced. In the meantime, said the officer, I'd advise you to remain at Twin Elms and continue solving the mystery there. From what you tell me about your father, I'm sure he'll be able to get out of the difficulty himself even before the police find him. Aloud, Nancy promised to stay on call in case Captain Rosalind might need her. But in her own mind, the young sleuth determined that if she got any kind of a lead concerning her father, she was most certainly going to follow it up. Nancy left police headquarters and strolled up the street, deep in thought. Instead of things getting better, all my problems seem to be getting worse. Maybe I'd better call Hannah. Since she had been a little girl, Nancy had found solace in talking to Hannah Gruen. The housekeeper had always been able to give her such good advice. Nancy went into a drugstore and entered one of the telephone booths. She called the Drew home in River Heights and was pleased when Mrs. Gruen answered. The housekeeper was aghast to learn Nancy's news, but said she thought Captain Rosalind's advice was sound. You've given the police the best leads in the world, and believe me, that's all you can do. But wait, the housekeeper suddenly said, if I were you, Nancy, I'd call up those railroad lawyers and tell them exactly what has happened. Your father's disappearance is directly connected with that bridge project, I'm sure, and the lawyers may have some ideas about where to find him. That's a wonderful suggestion, Hannah, Nancy said. I'll call them right away. But when the young detective phoned the railroad lawyers, she was disappointed to learn that all the men were out to lunch, and none of them would return before 2 o'clock. Oh dear, Nancy sighed. Well, I guess I'd better get a snack while waiting for them to come back. But in her worried state, she didn't feel like eating. There was a food counter at the rear of the drugstore, and Nancy made her way to it. Perching on a stool. She read the menu over and over, but nothing appealed to her. When the counterman asked her what she wanted, Nancy said frankly she didn't know. She was not very hungry. Then I recommend our split pea soup, he told her. It's homemade and out of this world. Nancy smiled at him. I'll take your advice and try it. Excuse me. Okay. The hot soup was delicious. By the time she had finished it, Nancy's spirits had risen considerably. And how about some custard pie? The counterman inquired. It's just like Mother used to make. All right, Nancy answered, smiling at the solicitous young man. The pie was ice cold and proved to be delicious. When Nancy finished eating it, she glanced at her wristwatch. It was only 1:30. Seeing a rack of magazines, she decided to while away the time reading in her car. She purchased a magazine of detective stories, one of which proved to be so intriguing that the half hour went by quickly. Promptly at 2 o'clock, Nancy returned to the phone booth and called the offices of the railroad lawyers. The switchboard operator connected her with Mr. Anthony Barradale, and Nancy judged from his voice that he was fairly young. Quickly, she told her story. Mr. Drew being held a prisoner, Mr. Barradale cried out. While those underhanded property owners are certainly going to great lengths to gain a few dollars. The police were working on the case, but I thought perhaps your firm would like to take a hand also, Nancy told the lawyer. We certainly will, the young man replied. I'll speak to our senior partner about it. I know he will want to start work at once on the case. Thank you, said Nancy. She gave the address and telephone number of Twin Elms and asked the lawyers to get in touch with her there if any news should break. We'll do that, Mr. Barradale promised. Nancy left the drugstore and walked back to the car. Climbing in, she wondered what her next move ought to be. One thing is sure, she thought. Work is the best antidote for worry. I'll get back to Twin Elms and do some more sleuthing there. As she drove along, Nancy reflected about the ghost entering Twin Elms mansion by a subterranean passage. Since she had found no sign of one in any of the outbuildings on the estate, it occurred to her that probably it led from an obscure cave, either natural or man made. Such a device would be a clever artifice for an architect to use. Taking a little used road that ran along one side of the estate, Nancy recalled having seen a long grassed over hillock where she had assumed to be an old aqueduct. Perhaps this was actually the hidden entrance to Twin Elms. She parked her car at the side of the road and took a flashlight from the glove compartment. In anticipation of finding the answer to the riddle, Nancy crossed the field, and as she came closer to the beginning of the huge mound, she could see stones piled up. Getting nearer, she realized that indeed it was the entrance to a rocky cave. Well, maybe this time I found it, she thought, hurrying forward. The wind was blowing strongly and tossed her hair about her face. Suddenly, a freakish gust swept a newspaper from among the rocks and scattered the pages helter-skelter. Nancy was more excited than ever. The newspaper meant a human being had been there not long ago. The front page sailed towards her. As she grabbed it up, she saw to her complete astonishment that the paper was a copy of the River Heights Gazette. The date was the Tuesday before. Someone interested in River Heights has been here recently, the young sleuth said to herself excitedly. Who was this person? Her father? Gomber? Who? Wondering if the paper might contain any clue, Nancy dashed around to pick up all the sheets. As she spread them out on the ground, she noticed a hole in the page where classified ads appeared. This may be a very good clue, Nancy thought. As soon as I get back to the house, I'll call Hannah and have her look up Tuesday's paper to see what was in the ad. It suddenly occurred to Nancy that the person who had bought the paper to the cave might be inside this very minute. She must watch her step. He might prove to be an enemy. This may be where Dad is being held a prisoner, she thought wildly. Flashlight in hand, and her eyes darting intently about, Nancy proceeded cautiously into the cave. 5 feet, 10, she saw no one. 15 more, 20. Then Nancy met a dead end. The empty cave was almost completely round and had no other opening. Oh dear, another failure, Nancy told herself disappointedly as she retraced her steps. My only hope now is to learn something important from the ad in the paper. Nancy walked back across the field. Her eyes were down as she automatically looked for footprints. But presently she looked up and stared in disbelief. A man was standing alongside her car, examining it. His back was half turned to Nancy, so she couldn't see his face very well, but he had an athletic build, and his left ear was definitely crinkly. And so this is where we will leave it. Okay, 3 chapters down. We're good to go. Next Sunday evening, 9 o'clock, we will start with chapter 13 and read 13, 14, and 15. In case you're curious, there are 20 chapters in the book. So we have 3 more evenings of reading before we conclude the story. So I hope everyone has a great week. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Sharon Schultz, the Bay Lady. Follow me on Facebook, the Bay Lady. And please buy me a coffee. I love coffee and tea. Good night, everyone.